Hi, I'm Colin Sanders and this is the History Books Review. I'm continuing my extended review of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This is the second part of chapter 35 and we have come to the awesome, in every sense of the word, invasion of Gaul by Attila the Hun. The exact extent of his empire isn't known, but we do know it was huge. In addition to the Huns themselves, Attila was able to deploy considerable numbers of allies. Some German tribes were entirely under his sway, like the Heruli for example. Some tribes, like the Franks, were split into pro and anti-Hun factions. Others, like the Goths and the Saxons, were pretty much anti-Hun, though even this doesn't preclude some of their members of the tribe might have thrown in their lot with Attila. He was, after all, likely to be the winner, and in the ancient world there was a lot to be said for picking the winning team. In addition to the Germans, there were also Allan tribes that could be coerced, whose fighting skills resembled those of the Huns themselves. So, to pull together his army, Attila was able to call on help and support from a wide area, probably the whole of modern Germany and Poland, a big chunk of the Ukraine and the area to the north of the Danube, modern Hungary, Romania, Austria and the states in that region. And it is fair to assume that a summons from Attila was not one that you would ignore lightly. How big was his army when he crossed the border? The closest contemporary source is the historian Jordanes, who estimates he had 500,000 men at his command. This is probably an exaggeration, but maybe not too much of one. Many centuries later, Napoleon was able to pull together an army of 500,000 from a possibly smaller area, so maybe that number isn't totally impossible. Roman diplomacy since the time of Augustus had as its major objective the prevention of the unity of Germany. Now, under Attila, this was what had effectively happened. Now it was the Roman world that was divided. The Huns were so numerous that the attack had to take place in summer when forage for the horses was plentiful, rather than the more usual barbarian practice of waiting for winter. But previously it had been necessary to wait for rivers to freeze over so they could be crossed away from Roman fortifications. This was no longer necessary. The fortifications had already been swept away decades earlier. The Huns could attack where and when they liked. Where they liked turned out to be the confluence of the Neckar and the Rhine. This is the location of modern-day Mannheim, but at the time there was no bridge available, so a makeshift one was constructed from trees felled in the Hercynian forest. Once this obstacle was overcome, the Huns poured unopposed into Gaul, destroying any city that lay in their path. Some had a few troops to put up some kind of resistance. Some were saved by subsequently well-publicised miracles, but, as Gibbon rightly puts it, the bulk of the towns of the cities were alike destitute of both troops and saints. Siegecraft was not the Huns' speciality, but they could deal with a defended city if they had to. They obviously didn't have to very often though, because they were soon deep inside what is now France. They turned away from Paris. It was saved by Saint Genevieve, and instead settled in to the attack on nearby Orleans, which had the advantage of occupying a strategic position and not apparently meriting divine intervention on its behalf. It must have seemed like the end of the world to the besieged inhabitants. The empire had already been wrecked by the relatively small numbers of the only mildly savage Germans. The Huns were the real deal when it came to barbarism, and they had arrived in much greater numbers. One wonders at his optimism, but the Bishop of Orleans, Annianus, took command of what must have looked like a hopeless defence against overwhelming odds. After a few days of stout defending, the city was approaching crisis point. The battering rams of the Huns began to demolish the walls, and parts of the city were already occupied and were being sacked. Annianus sent a messenger to scan the horizon to see if help was on its way. As is customary in these stories, he returned twice without any news. On the third, he saw a distant cloud and reported this curious observation. Annianus, possibly grasping at straws, instantly announced it was the aid of God. The word was taken up by the inhabitants, who took up the shout. It was probably comforting to have something with which to drown out the noise of the Hun battering rams. Meanwhile, the distant object came into full focus, and it turned out to indeed be the aid of God in the form of an army led by Aetius. The Huns soon made the same observation. Their possession was now precarious, and Attila rapidly raised the siege and escaped before the relief column arrived. I should point out that there is an alternative interpretation of the sources by John Bagnall Bury. In his reading, Orleans was threatened by Attila, but saved not at the last moment by Aetius appearing to save the day, as at the last moment, but by the timely reinforcements sent to anticipate Attila's movements. Gibbon's version is a lot more dramatic, but Bury's does make a bit more sense in view of the position Aetius was in. Aetius had crossed the Alps on news of the invasion with a handful of troops to do what he could to save the situation. It didn't look at all promising. He wasn't just outnumbered, he was completely insignificant. His position at court was based on his relationship with Attila, the very man he had to defeat, but Aetius was to prove a more resourceful leader in a tight spot than might have been expected. His first problem was the Visigothic kingdom under Theodoric. Theodoric was the illegitimate son of Alaric, the man who had sacked Rome some 40 years before. He had been a long-serving and well-liked king of the Goths. He was nominally an ally of Rome, and was currently quite close to Rome, and was about to make common cause with the Romans against the Vandal kingdom in Africa. But he was an independent ally who was quite capable of trying to capture cities from imperial control when the occasion arose. The time when he paraded a captured Roman general through his capital city would have been reasonably fresh in everybody's mind. But he was at least reliably anti-Hun. The Goths were as close to being the hegemonic power over the German tribes as anyone, and it was the Goths that had lost most by the rise of the Huns. The initial news was far from promising. Theodoric was planning to wait in his own territory to face the Huns as and when they turned up. If Aetius was to have any hope of turning the Huns back, he needed the manpower that only the Goths could provide. Aetius persuaded an elderly statesman called Avitus out of retirement. Avitus arrived at the court of Theodoric and put on a display of rhetoric worthy of the great traditions of Greece and Rome. He recalled to the minds of the Goths the injuries that their ancestors had received from the hands of the Huns, the same Huns who now pursued them to the Pyrenees. He played on their sense of duty, pointing out that every Christian should consider it his duty to defend the churches and the pious populations from the hands of wrathful pagans. And he also reminded them that as they were now the owners of the land, the destruction of the crops and the vineyards would be a direct attack on their own property. When he had finished, the Goths had been won over and would accept Aetius as the general in command for the duration of the crisis. Having got the big one on board, it was easier to get the rest to follow. The messengers of Aetius scoured Gaul for allies, and he successfully mustered an army composed of the Laeti, the Bretons, the Brions, the Saxons, the Burgundians, the Alans, the Ripuarians, and the Franks of the faction who followed Meroveus. Watch that name, it'll crop up again later. Such was the force that converged on Orleans and compelled Attila to take flight. But it was no more than a strategic withdrawal. Attila pulled back to the area around Chalons, which is flat and suitable to cavalry manoeuvres. Aetius was hot on his heels. We have no detailed account of the campaign, and Gibbon is at his weakest when describing military affairs. But the other great historian of this period, John Bagnall Bury, interprets the movements as basically being an extended war of space and movement that Attila did rather badly at. I'm inclined to go with JBB here. The mere fact that Attila reached Orleans but was brought to battle at Chalons some 300 kilometres to the northeast does sound like he had at least to some extent lost the initiative. So while Gibbon portrays the Hun as a great and successful military leader, Bagnall Bury dismisses him as an amateur. He doesn't even think that Orleans was even attacked, believing that Aetius had succeeded in inferring the objective of his enemy and thwarting it with a preemptive movement of troops into the area. Both accounts seem equally plausible to me. Aetius certainly was a very good general, and he knew his foe very well. Nobody else gave Attila as much trouble. Does this mean that Attila was necessarily a second-rate general? He wouldn't have been the first man to have risen to great heights as a result of other more able men's efforts, but we have only a partial picture of him, so it's hard to say. After all, if the only information we had about Napoleon was that he led a great empire and an account of his handling of the Battle of Waterloo, we might doubt his credentials as a great general too. But however we interpret how the battle was set up, there is no doubt that a huge battle took place at Chalons and that great numbers of men fought and died in it. Aetius took the advantage early by occupying some high ground that gave a view of the field of battle. He and his troops realised that they had ended up in a disadvantageous position. Supernatural guidance was sought. The haruspices examined the entrails of sacred animals and predicted that Attila would be defeated, but that his enemy would be slain. It seemed that the situation was grim, but the initiative was quickly taken back by Attila. His style of warfare favoured the attack, and Attila addressed his troops, urging them on to do great deeds. He affected to despise the cowardice of the Romans that obliged them to fight in close order. Only the Goths were worthy opponents, and the Huns had beaten them many times before. He would lead from the front and would personally cast the first javelin. To do this, he would take up his position in the centre, in the midst of the heaviest fighting. The left was taken up by the Heruli, the Franks, the Burgundians, and commanded by 3 brothers who ruled over the Ostrogoths. The right was in the hands of Ardaric, the king of the Gepids. The forces following Attila were very similar in ethnicity to those on the Roman side, sometimes identical, but Attila sounded his trumpets and his drums, so his diverse followers would all be marching to the same beat. Aetius was not leading the kind of army that he could address in person. There probably wasn't a common language that would work anyway, but he had to be wary of the loyalty of some of his own side. In particular, the Alans, under Sangiban, were closely aligned with the Huns, and it was not impossible that they would make common cause with their kinsmen. To make this temptation unappealing, they were positioned in the centre to make switching sides difficult. Theodoric was in command on the right, so the Ostrogoths were face to face with the Visigoths. Aetius took the left, presumably with his small corps of Roman legionaries. The lead up to the Battle of Chalons had been a war of mobility, manoeuvre and counter-manoeuvre. Aetius may well have had the advantage of good staff work, maps and prior military records. In any case, he seems to have had the best of that phase, but now the two armies were face to face. It was pure hand-to-hand fighting. The bravery of the Germans and the tactics of the Romans could finally be put to good use against the now immobilised Huns. Even so, the battle was hard fought, and although the Huns had the worst of it and were forced to retreat, they were far from being routed. As darkness fell, the field was in the hands of Aetius and his allies, but the casualties were enormous. No reliable figures can be quoted. Gibbon dismisses both figures from classical accounts as fantastical. The estimate of 165,000 only seems reasonable when compared to the other of 300,000. He doesn't hazard a guess at the true figure, but let's have a go. I think I can come up with our own guesstimate. Most modern estimates work by looking at Roman troop numbers and drawing inferences from them. This gives you roughly 100,000 on the Roman side, with a few reasonable assumptions. That the battle was close suggests an even number on both sides, so you get a total involvement of 200,000. This can't be too far off. I thought about it in a different way. In a similar crisis on a smaller scale, King Harold of England was able to assemble an army of about 10,000 to face the Norman invasion of about the same number at Hastings in 1066. Harold had an area maybe a tenth the size of the one that Aetius is working on, so that seems a reasonable guess that Aetius would be able to get about 100,000 fighting men behind his banners. The casualty figures are not known precisely at Hastings, but the best estimate seems to be about 25%. If so, the much bigger battle at Chalons could have claimed 50,000 lives. It was a similar hand-to-hand slug between troops unable to get to move much. This was an atrocious bloodbath that justifies the ancient historian's comment that a whole generation can be swept away by the madness of kings in a few hours. We'll look at the aftermath of this battle next time. If you have any comments, I'd love to hear them in all the normal places, and in the meantime, thanks for listening.